Oxford Bookworms, Stage 1. Little Lord Fauntleroy, by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Retold by Jennifer Bassett. Published and copyright Oxford University Press, 2009. Read by Wayne Forrester. Chapter 1. A Big Surprise. Cedric Errol and his mamma were very good friends. This was important because there were only two of them. Cedric's father was dead, and it was a sad day in the little house in New York when Mrs. Errol told Cedric this news.
"Dear, dear Ceddie," she said, "your papa was very ill last week, and he's not coming home to us. He's never coming home again because—"
And then she began to cry. Cedric was only 7 years old, but he was a very loving little boy. He went at once to his mamma and put his little arms around her and his face next to her face. They did not need any more words. So Cedric and his mother were alone in the world. Mrs. Errol's mother and father were dead, and Mr. Errol's family was in England. Mr. Errol's father, Cedric's grandfather, was an important man. He was the Earl of Dorincourt, the head of one of the oldest and most famous families in England. He lived at Dorincourt Castle and was very rich. But he was not a nice person. He was an angry, bad-tempered old man, and he hated America and Americans. So when his youngest son, Cedric's father, married an American girl in New York, a girl without money or family, just a nobody, the Earl was very angry. He wrote this letter to his son. "Never come to Dorincourt Castle, and never write to me. I don't want to see you again. Don't ask me for help or money. You can live or die. I don't want to know. You are no longer my son." The Earl had 2 older sons, but they were bad, selfish men. They spent the Earl's money on horses and women, never said a kind word or did a good thing in their lives. Nobody liked them, and their father hated them. They were a black page in the book of the Dorincourt family. Cedric's father was very different from his brothers. He had a beautiful face, was tall and strong, and had the kindest heart in the world. Everybody loved him. He was very sad when his father's angry letter arrived. He loved his home in England, and he even loved his bad-tempered old father. But he was young and happy with his sweet young wife. Soon Cedric arrived, and there never was a happier child than little Ceddie. He slept well, he ate well, he smiled a lot and never cried. And he had big brown eyes and beautiful golden yellow hair. When he was older, he still smiled a lot, and he was the happiest, friendliest little boy in the world. Everybody liked him. Everybody liked to talk to him when they met him in the street. He had some good friends. There was Mr. Hobbs, the grocery man, in the store at the end of their street. There were the children along the street, and there was Dick, the bootblack boy. And there was Bridget. Bridget had 12 children, and her husband was a builder. But he was often ill and could not work. And then there was no money for the rent. Cedric felt very sorry for them all when life was difficult. Cedric's best friend was his mamma. Her eyes were sad, and she always wore a black dress. But she was young and pretty, and she loved her little boy very much. So life went on for Cedric Errol and his friends. Then, one day, everything changed. Mrs. Errol had a visitor from England. He was a tall old man in dark clothes. His name was Mr. Havisham, and he was the lawyer for the Earl of Dorincourt. He had some very surprising news for Cedric's mother. "You know that the Earl had 3 sons, Mrs. Errol," he said. "The 2 older sons, Bevis and Maurice, died 2 or 3 months ago, one in an accident and the other from an illness. They were not married, and they had no children. Your husband is dead too, and so his son is now the heir. Cedric Errol is now Lord Fauntleroy, and the next Earl of Dorincourt after his grandfather dies." Mrs. Errol's face went very white. "Oh," she said, "is the Earl going to take Cedric away from me? We are so happy together. I tried to be a good mother to him." Mr. Havisham was not a family man. He was a lawyer, a cold man of business. But he saw that Mrs. Errol was a loving mother. His next news was difficult to say. "I must tell you, Mrs. Errol," he said, "that the Earl is not very friendly to you. He does not like America or Americans, and he was very angry when his son married you. I am sorry to say this, but he does not want to see you. He wants Lord Fauntleroy to live with him at Dorincourt Castle, but he wants you to live in a different house. He is giving you a house called Court Lodge, and there Lord Fauntleroy can visit you every day." Mr. Havisham watched Mrs. Errol carefully. "Is she going to cry?" he thought. He did not know the right words to say to a crying woman. But Mrs. Errol did not cry. She stood for a moment at the window, then turned and looked at the lawyer.
"My husband loved Dorincourt," she said quietly. "He loved England, and everything English. He was very sad to leave it all. So I think Ceddie must go back and learn how to be an English earl."
She looked at the lawyer with her sweet, sad eyes.
"I hope the earl can learn to love Ceddie. He is only little, and he is a very loving child."
Mr. Havisham thought about the old earl. He was a bad-tempered, selfish old man, and did not love anyone. But the lawyer did not say this. "Mrs. Errol," he said, "the Earl wants the best of everything for his grandson. He wants him to be happy. Your son is going to have a very good life at Dorincourt." A short time later, Cedric came home from a visit to his friend, Mr. Hobbs, the grocery man. He was very surprised to find a visitor in the sitting room. His mother ran to him and took his hands.
"Oh, Ceddie!" she cried. "Dear, dear Ceddie!"
Mr. Havisham stood up and looked down at Cedric. "And so this," he said slowly, "is little Lord Fauntleroy." Chapter 2. Saying Goodbye to America. It was a lot of news for a 7-year-old boy. Uncles dying, an English grandfather, a new home in England, a new name. He did not understand it all at first, and when he did, he was not very happy.
"Oh, dearest,"
he said to his mother. Cedric's father always called her dearest, and so the little boy used the name too.
"I don't think I want to be an earl. None of the boys in our street are earls. Please, can I not be one?" "Your papa loved his home in England, Ceddie," said his mother. "I think he would like you to go there and be an earl one day." "I'm sorry to leave all my friends, Dick and Bridget and everyone," said Cedric sadly. "And Mr. Hobbs isn't going to like the news. He says kings and lords are all bad people. America has a president, and Mr. Hobbs says presidents are much better than kings."
The next day, Cedric went to see Mr. Hobbs at his grocery store. He sat down in his usual place, but at first he could not find the words to tell Mr. Hobbs his news. Then he said it all at once, very quickly. Mr. Hobbs stared at him. "Well," he said, "can this be true?"
"Yes, Mr. Hobbs," said Cedric. "I'm sorry to say it's all true. Mr. Havisham says I am Lord Fauntleroy now, and one day I'm going to be the Earl of Dorincourt after my grandfather dies."
"Well," said Mr. Hobbs. "Well, well, well." They talked about it for a long time, and in the end, Mr. Hobbs was happier about lords and earls. He liked his young friend very much. He first knew Cedric when he was 6 weeks old, and he had a grandfatherly interest in the boy. But he did not like Cedric going to England. "Can't you stay here and be an earl?" he asked.
"No, I can't," said Cedric sadly. "Dearest says we must go to England."
The Dorincourt name was an old and famous one, and the family was very rich, with great houses and castles in England. Mr. Havisham, the family's lawyer for 40 years, knew the Earl very well. He remembered the Earl's words to him before he left England. "I hate that American woman. She married my son because he was an earl's son, and she wanted to be rich. Her son is going to be just like her." But after a week in New York, Mr. Havisham knew differently.
"Mrs. Errol married the Earl's son because she loved him with all her heart," he thought. "She's not interested in money. She asks nothing for herself. She only wants her little boy to be happy. I think the Earl is wrong about her and about her little boy."
Mr. Havisham was surprised and pleased by the new Lord Fauntleroy. Cedric was a fine boy, tall and strong, with his mother's brown eyes and his father's golden hair. He spoke well, was not afraid of anything, and was friendly with everyone. He had a kind heart, too. Mr. Havisham learnt that very soon. One day, he was with Cedric when his mother was out. Mr. Havisham wanted to talk to him about his new life in England. But Cedric spoke first.
"Please, what is an earl?" he asked. "I don't know anything about them. Please, can you tell me?"
"An earl is a very important person," Mr. Havisham said. "He usually comes from a very old family. The first Earl of Dorincourt lived 400 years ago."
"Well, well," said Cedric. "That was a long time ago. That's interesting. But what does an earl do?"
This was not an easy question to answer. "An earl," Mr. Havisham began, "an earl often helps the king. Perhaps he's a soldier for the king. Some earls were very brave men in the old days."
"Oh," said Cedric. "My papa was a soldier, and he was a very brave man, you know. I'm pleased earls are brave. It's a good thing to be brave, don't you think?"
"Yes," Mr. Havisham said. "There is another good thing about earls. Some of them have money. a lot of money."
"That's a good thing to have," said Cedric. "I'd like a lot of money."
"Would you?" said Mr. Havisham. "Why?"
"Well,"
Cedric said happily,
"a person can do so many things with money, you see. I can buy beautiful things for Dearest, like books and pretty dresses. I can buy a warm winter coat for Bridget. She lives in our street and has 12 children. And a present for Mr. Hobbs at the grocery store. And then for Dick—"
"Who is Dick?" asked Mr. Havisham.
"Dick is a bootblack,"
said Lord Fauntleroy.
"He cleans people's boots in the street, you know. He's one of the nicest people in the world. When I was little, he was very kind to me once. And when someone is kind to you, you never forget it, do you?"
"And what would you like to do for Dick?" asked the lawyer. He smiled a little smile. A bootblack, a grocery man, a poor woman with 12 children. Strange friends for the grandson of an earl.
"Buy the business for him,"
said the young lord happily.
"He works for Jake now, and Jake is no good, you see. Dick does all the work, and Jake takes all the money. Dick gets so angry. Dick needs new brushes and new clothes and a sign, and then he can get somewhere."
At that moment, Mrs. Errol came home.
"I am so sorry to be late," she said. "I was at the house of a friend. Her husband is ill, and she needs help, poor thing." "Oh!"
cried the young lord. He jumped up from his chair.
"That's Bridget. I must visit her too."
"One moment," said the lawyer. He remembered the Earl's words. "The boy can have anything. Tell him that. Put money in his pockets, and tell him it came from his grandfather." Mr. Havisham told Mrs. Errol and Cedric about the Earl's money, but he said it more kindly. Then he asked, "So, would Lord Fauntleroy like to help this poor woman?" At first, Cedric did not understand. His mother put her arms around him.
"Ceddie, dear,"
she said,
"the Earl is your grandpapa, your papa's father. He's very kind, and he loves you, and he wants you to love him. He wants you to be happy and to make other people happy. He's very rich, and he gave Mr. Havisham some money for you. You can give some to Bridget now, to pay her rent, and to buy food for her husband and her children. Isn't that fine, Ceddie? Isn't he good?"
Cedric's face was suddenly very excited. He looked from his mother to Mr. Havisham.
"Can I have it now?" he cried. "Can I run to her house and give it to her this minute?"
Mr. Havisham gave Cedric $25, and Cedric was out of the house in seconds. A short time later, Cedric was back. with a big smile on his face.
"Bridget cried,"
he said.
"She cried because she was so happy. I think I'm going to like being an earl."
The old lawyer smiled his little smile again. "What's the Earl going to think about that?" he thought. "He gives his grandson money, and the boy gives it to a poor woman to pay her rent." The day for leaving New York came quickly. In the last days, Lord Fauntleroy was very busy. With the Earl's money, Bridget's children all had new clothes, and Mr. Hobbs had a very fine gold watch from his little friend.
"Look,"
said Cedric.
"the watch has our names on the back, so you can't forget me."
Mr. Hobbs held the watch in his hand, and at first he could not speak. "I'm not going to forget you, my boy," he said at last. "You never forget a good friend, do you?" Dick, too, could not find words at first to thank his little friend. He now had new brushes, a big new sign, and the best bootblack business in New York. On the last day, he came to the house to say goodbye.
"I'm sorry he's going away. I really am,"
he said to Mr. Havisham.
"I never had a friend like him."
Dick shook Cedric's hand for a long time.
"Goodbye,"
he said.
"Write and tell me all about it, earls and everything."
That evening, Cedric's mamma was very quiet. Cedric held her hand.
"It's sad saying goodbye to all our friends and our little house, isn't it, dearest?"
he said.
"Yes, Ceddie dear, it is,"
she said.
"very, very sad."